This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Over the past few weeks, I've been painting up the very first batch of my brand new Dark Angels army. And today, I think I'm finally ready to show you the relatively streamlined process I've developed for 3 different variations on the classic Dark Angels color scheme, including the classic green wing armor, the bone white Deathwing armor, as well as a sort of camo scheme that I've cooked up for the scouts. Step 1. Deathwing Zenithal. I started out by priming everyone in some Vallejo German Brown primer. While I typically like to start out most of my models with a black primer or maybe a Zenithal, in this particular case I wanted to start out from a basis of warmth, both for the forest soil of the basing, but also for the bone white armor and robes. And even for the dark forest green elements, I think a ruddy red-brown makes a great shadow color because of its position on the color wheel. As a second step, I added a spray from above with Pro-Acryl Golden Brown, which I think makes a great mid-tone for any sort of bone white armor or cloth. After this, we finish up our shading triad with a more controlled spray of Pro-Acryl Ivory from directly above the models, hitting all of the points where the light would hit the strongest, such as the tops of the shoulders, the tops of the heads or helmets, and the backpacks. I also use this color to give just a little hit of light to any of the points of light on the models, such as the plasma coils or the lanterns. Step 2. Undershot shading. Next, I wanted to give everyone some additional shading from below with our hardened leather speed paint to bring the whole look together, starting by spraying the base of the model from the sides to shade the forest undergrowth, and then spraying upwards and underneath the model to give the armor and cloth some nice earthy brown shadows. And while I already had this color in my airbrush, I also went in and applied this paint to any of the leather areas that were easy to access to save time painting things later. I even started the foundation of a sort of camo cloak pattern here with this color for the Space Marine Scouts, just applying random patterns like you might see in a camo color scheme. And with that, the basics of our bone white color scheme are all pretty much set, but what about the green? Step 3, the green. Now that we have all of the bone white areas taken care of, we can finally load up our airbrush with some Vallejo Angel Green. For the armor plates, I started by spraying from below and to the sides of the armor, attempting to maintain some of the built-in shading we already did during the bone white step. I also painted any green cloth areas at this point as well, doing my best not to have any spillover onto the white armor. And I also continued the camo pattern on the scouts with this color while I was at it. To finish up, I sprayed just little pops of green onto the foliage on the bases to give things a more foresty look, and with the foundations of our green applied, I then added some shading to darken everything into a more Dark Angels level of forest green, using Speed Paint Absolution Green. And while this process may seem sort of backwards to some of you, when painting darker colors, I often find the best way to apply highlights is to not apply highlights at all, and instead to start off with the brightest highlight and work our way darker and darker. With this dark green, I used a similar process as with the hardened leather we applied before as a shade color, shooting it mostly from the sides and below the model to add the shading that we want, and leaving the higher highlighted areas alone. To finish up, I once again added some of this color to the green cloth areas, the camo areas on the scouts, as well as tiny bits of foliage to the bases. Step 4, Burgundy. One of my favorite colors that I've noticed being added more and more to new Dark Angels releases is this really dark red color. That's right, this is red. On first glance, I thought this new accent color was a dark desaturated purple, but it's actually just a very deep wine red color. I would call it a burgundy, which is why I think it looks so great in contrast with the green elements on the armor. But anyway, I thought the speed paint murder scene was a pretty good match for this color, so I used this speed paint to paint all of the guns and a few other details on each model. But the really fun part about this color is that because it's directly across from green on the color wheel, it makes an excellent shadow color for our dark green armor as well. And you can see when I apply it as a shade, it makes an almost black but somehow slightly more vibrant shadow tone that I really quite like. So I know you've probably heard this advice before, but if you're looking for a good shadow color for something, just look directly across the color wheel and you'll find a great shade color. As with the rest of the colors so far, I also applied bits of this color to the camo cloaks and to the bases of the models, which I think really makes the bases look like a darker, more Death World type forest planet like Caliban. Or perhaps Mirror Caliban. Step 5. Magic Blue. Finally, for the plasma coils and lanterns, I applied a spray of speed paint Magic Blue. We'll give these plasma areas more detail later, but I just wanted to start out by blocking them in a bit with the color they're eventually going to be. And as a bit of an experiment, I also gave all the models just a subtle spray of this Magic Blue from above to tint all of the greens into a slightly more bluish green range without going full turquoise. And from here, all that's left is a whole bunch of washes, highlighting, and other fun details. But do you know what else has really fun details? That's right, it's this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform for all of your website needs. And it's super easy to use. Just pick from one of their fabulously designed pre-made templates and then customize things to your heart's content using a suite of drop-down menus and drag and drop modules. No coding or technical knowledge required. If you can assemble a sprue of dark angels, you can build a Squarespace website. I've been using my current Squarespace site to host a gallery of my painted miniatures, all of my hobby reference documents, as well as an online store, which has been super easy to set up, keep updated, and comes built in with a ton of the payment processors you would want. And you can sell anything you want on there, from physical items to digital items, services, memberships, the works. So if you need a website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial? And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. And now back to our video. Step 6, panel lining and washes. One of the downsides of starting out with a lighter base tone on our models is we don't get those deep dark shadows built in that we would if we started off with a black base coat. So to compensate, as a first step after getting all of the airbrush stuff done, I used one of my favorite speed paint colors, Turnbull Turquoise, to carefully panel line all of the green armor plates, all of the burgundy colored bits, as well as painting in any areas that I want to be black or that I plan to paint in another color like silver later. You could of course use any black or really dark color for this, but I like to use something like a speed paint because it naturally wants to go into the recesses of things, but it's also more opaque than using just a simple wash. As for why I chose Turnbull Turquoise instead of a simple black speed paint or contrast paint, I chose this color because it's almost black, but it has a slightly cooler tone to it, making it a much more interesting color, I think, for shadows than a plain black. After this, I panel lined all of the bone white armor using hardened leather in the same way, and at the same time, I painted any brown leather areas, such as any straps, boots, pouches, anything I want to be brown later on. I also went over the hardened leather panel lining in a few places on the bone white armor with Turnbull Turquoise, wherever I felt the crevices needed to feel a bit deeper and darker. And while I had my washes out, I also continued the camo pattern on the scouts, not just on the cloaks this time, but also on any of the cloth areas on their uniforms. And for this, I used larger patches of hardened leather speed paint and followed this up with smaller dots of Absolution green speed paint. While I had this green speed paint out and on my brush, I also used it in a variety of places to just darken up some of the green areas on various models where a Turnbull turquoise shadow would have been too extreme and I wanted something more green. And with our panel lining complete, it's now time to move on to step 7, the eyes. As a little bit of a break from all of the more monotonous steps, I usually like to paint the eyes on the models around this stage in the paint scheme, just because I feel like it instantly brings the model to life once the eyes are painted, and it's a fun break task to do after doing all that panel lining. The process that I used for this is to first fill the eyes with Turnbull turquoise, which we did at the previous step, and then I carefully painted in the lenses with Pro Acryl Ivory. After this, I apply a thin coat of bold Pyrrole Red over the ivory, and then I add 1 or 2 dots of ivory to represent reflected lights. Then for potency and so that these look cool under black light, I then add a final layer to the lenses of the helmets using fluorescent red. For the eyes on the flesh faces, I then use a very similar process, first painting in the eyes with Turnbull turquoise, and then using ivory to paint in just a single dot of white to suggest the model is looking in a certain direction, and because it's just easier than painting 2 dots of white. Step 8. Green highlights. This step can be as simple and quick or long and tedious as you want it to be. It just depends on how much you like shading armor. But for me, I mostly added simple edge highlighting to the green armor plates at this point instead of any fancy blending, as that's why we spent so much time with the airbrush in the first place. I started out by adding a few highlights as well as just base coating any green areas I missed with the airbrush using Angel Green. To level this up, in a few places I used Pro Acryl Green, which is a bit more of a intense saturated green, to add some edge highlights to the armor. And then when I wanted a slightly brighter highlight, I also mixed in successive amounts of marine mist into the Pro Acryl Green to get brighter and brighter cool highlights as needed. In some cases, I also used this opportunity to paint little scratches or dents on the armor using the same colors that I'm using to highlight with, and I just think that looks rather cool. Step 9, metallics. For the silver on these models, I used this brassy, antique-looking silver, and for the gold, I used this coppery, extremely Warhammer 40k looking gold. I used both colors relatively unthinned and applied them using the side of my brush in a sort of edge highlighting way. And while I was doing this, I also edge highlighted bits of the green armor with the metallic silver to show places where the paint had maybe chipped off of the armor a little bit, and I think that looks cool also. In a few places where I felt the metallics needed a bit more fleshing out, I applied a thinned down wash of hardened leather for the gold, or Turnbull turquoise for the silver. And then in both cases, I applied a few edge highlights with the brassy silver color to finish them off. Step 10, bone white. For any areas where I wanted to accentuate the bone white, I added a few highlights using the same colors we used with the airbrush, starting off with our yellow-brown and then mixing in successive amounts of ivory to build up highlights. On some of these areas, I definitely went a little bit overboard with the wet blending and shading, but that's just because I enjoy this sort of thing. Of course, you don't need to go this far with the bone white armor. If you're doing it yourself, you could just stop at the airbrush stage, maybe add a few edge highlights, but I just kind of got stuck having a lot of fun doing all the edge highlighting on these pale sand colored marines. I varied things up between smooth wet blending and more rough textural edge highlighting in places where I thought the armor might have gotten scratched up. And in some areas where I wanted a darker shadow, I mixed a bit of our German red-brown primer into the golden brown to get this sort of peachy, earthy color that I think works really well as a shadow color for this armor. Step 11, red accents. Red is a very important accent color for the Dark Angels, I think, to make them look like Dark Angels, and it also happens to be one of my favorite colors to paint. So when painting all of the red elements on the Marines, I went with a few different treatments. Starting out, I base coated or corrected any areas I missed earlier with the airbrush using Blanched Berry, which I think is a pretty good match for the speed paint murder scene we used earlier. Then for any areas where I wanted a warmer, more vibrant red like the Space Marine weapons, I used Pro Acryl Burnt Red to do some highlighting, followed up by an edge highlight of bold Pyrrole Red. For the areas where I wanted a more wine-colored, burgundy sort of red, such as the Purity Seals or the Scout weapons, which I thought would be a little less vibrant because they're supposed to be scouting around and hiding, I simply added successive amounts of ivory into the Blanched Berry base color to layer these up. Step 12, skin tones. For any of the bare-headed Marines, I used a variety of colors to paint their skin tones. As you can see, I already started a lot of these off using the airbrush phase with a base coat of either Murder Scene or Hardened Leather. And from here, I just had fun with it, adding one or two highlight layers using my collection of skin type colors and maybe a flesh wash to end things off when necessary. Of course, painting faces is a whole other subject I could do a whole other video on. So if you want to see a more in-depth take on that subject, be sure to let me know down in the comments. And if there's enough responses looking for a video like that, I'll make sure to prioritize making the face painting video in the future. Step 13, OSL. For the glowing plasma coils and the glowing lanterns, I used a two-stage process. Starting out by thinning down some titanium white and using it like a wash on the plasma coils, and then following this up by edge highlighting the coils once they were dry with a 50-50 mix of titanium white and Pro Acryl Jade. I also thinned down this same paint color with water to create a sort of glaze to apply to the surrounding areas to give the impression of projected light. And once this was done, I gave another wash of thinned titanium white over the coils to make it even brighter. Finally, at the last minute, I decided to try another experiment and applied an overall glaze of this new fluorescent green color that I've been really enjoying lately to both the light sources and areas around the light sources to create a sort of fade from turquoise to neon green. In fact, I ended up liking how this color looked so much that I used this same fluorescent green on various buttons and lights throughout the army, and I even used it as a sort of final highlight color on some of the green robes and armor to really intensify those greens. Step 14, decals and freehand. Finally, I finished off these Marines by adding any relevant unit markings using water slide decals. After carefully applying each decal, I then used a 50-50 mix of water and matte varnish to seal things in place, and coincidentally, I found that adding this varnish had an effect on the shoulder plates that I really liked. It sort of darkened the colors down a bit, maybe it made them a bit more matte, you could say. So I ended up liking this so much that I applied this same mix of matte varnish over all of the armor plates on the models to give the ceramite a consistent look. And as a side note, if you're looking for a really good comprehensive guide on Dark Angel's unit organization and the different markings they're supposed to have, I highly recommend David Ely's website. That was super helpful to me. I'll leave a link down in the description. He's the Dark Angels expert. Once the matte varnish was dry, I found that all of the white parts on the decals were all now a little bit too bright for my liking. I wanted them all to look more bone white like the rest of the color scheme, so in order to achieve this, I painted on a thin coat of speed paint Pallid Bone over any of these white areas to tint things into a creamier ivory tone. I ended up liking how this looked so much that I went back in and applied Pallid Bone as an additional shade color to all of the bone white armor. This had the effect of darkening down all of the armor quite a bit, but I think overall I like this look a lot more than the previous look that I'd painted on the bone armor. It's a lot dirtier and more weathered looking, and I felt like it also had the side effect of smoothing out some of the rougher blends I had done previously. Next time I paint bone white armor, Pallid Bone I think will definitely be part of the workflow from the beginning, so stay tuned for the next time I paint bone white armor. I think I'm definitely going to refine this workflow and make it a lot simpler and easier to do. I also found a similar thing happened when I applied the red decals to the miniatures. I found that I wanted the red on the Space Marine guns to match the red on their shoulder plate decals. So to quickly amend this, I went in and edge highlighted all of the guns with warm yellow, and then I applied a coat of bold Pyrrole Red over top of this to translate all of that yellow into red highlights, as well as brightening up all of the midtones into a brighter red. Finally, I added an overall wash of dusk red to the bases, thinned down about 50% with speed paint medium to darken the bases up a little bit, make them look a little bit more like a forest floor. And after this, I found I wanted to add just a little bit more visible leaves and foliage to really drive the point home that this is a forest floor. So I created this mixture of crushed up miniature leaves, tacky glue, a little bit of water, a little bit of dusk red just to tie in the colors with the previous wash, and just a pinch of green flocking, which I applied to the bases in these areas where I wanted a little bit more greenery. Once this was dry, I color corrected everything by dry brushing on just a little bit of green paint in some areas, a little bit of yellow to highlight the tips of the plants, and some warm orange-brown where necessary to clean things up. And that's it. Our first division of Dark Angels are now complete. I believe this represents 415 points as of this video's publication, which is not quite a playable force as of yet, but gives us a great place to start and expand from. I'm excited to eventually add some of the more flavorful and high points cost units to fill out this force, such as Azrael, the Inner Circle Companions, maybe some Deathwing Knights, or even the Lion himself eventually. So stay tuned if you'd like to continue to watch this army grow in the future. And if you want to help support me and my work and gain access to all kinds of bonus features, be sure to check out my Patreon or YouTube memberships, where you can get bonus content for as little as $2 a month. It super helps me out. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.